Hello again and welcome all. Thank you to those of you who have just joined. We're going to go ahead and get started. So again, welcome to today's training. Who are the Afghan newcomers? Understanding the background and socio-cultural strengths and needs of Afghan evacuees to the United States. My name is Meg Gibbon and I'm the Deputy Director for Switchboard. Switchboard is a one-stop training and resource center for refugee service providers in the US. Let's take a look at a few logistics here in Zoom before we get started. First, I want to say that today's training is being recorded. It will run for about 90 minutes, and you'll be able to find that 90-minute recording, the webinar slides, and the transcript on our website in the next few days. If you'd like to switch your audio between your phone and computer, you can do that at any time using the audio settings menu in the lower left corner of your screen. Due to the very large number of participants we have joining us today, the participant chat box is disabled. So those of you who are used to using chat on Switchboard webinars, please make a note of this, that the Q&A will be your main function for today. This is just because we have so many participants that it would move too quickly for us to follow. So please keep an eye on that chat for any messages from Switchboard or from your panelists, as well as links to various recordings we've been mentioning throughout. But just note that you're not able to engage that way today. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Please do type any questions that you have into the Q&A, and you'll have the option to click the thumbs up icon to vote for another participant's question. We will address as many of your questions as we can during our Q&A period at the end. We've also reviewed the questions that you submitted during your pre-registration, and we plan to cover many of them during the course of the training today. Lastly, you do have the option to turn on closed captions for today's training by clicking CC. To do so, you can choose subtitles or full transcript within the menu there, and you have options to change the font size and some of your other parameters. And this is something you can turn on and off at any time. I want to emphasize that the closed captioning on today's webinar is automated, so it might not be completely accurate, but following the webinar, we will post a fully edited transcript to the Switchboard website, as we do for all of Switchboard's audio and video materials. So please keep an eye out for that. All right, we are going to be joined by an incredible panel of facilitators and panelists today. And to start us off, I'm so pleased to introduce Farid Saydee, founder and president of Language Mentors International, as well as Durana Saydee, research associate at Language Mentors International. Over to you, Farid.
Thank you, Meg. Hello and salam alaikum, everyone. I also take the opportunity to thank everyone of you for what you're doing to help these Afghan newcomers. In the next 90 minutes, we will learn and discuss useful information about Afghans in Afghanistan in general, and also about newcomers in particular. The learning objectives for this webinar include defining Afghan newcomers and recognizing the events that have led to their displacement, naming and understanding cultural norms, understanding newcomers' expectations and some misconceptions that they may have. And finally, learning some tips on how to communicate effectively with them. But before that, first, let's do a poll to learn where you currently work. If you can take like a few seconds to answer this question.
Great, so that poll is open now. We'll leave that open for about 30 seconds. All right, we're going to go ahead and close that poll and share out those results.
Okay, so as we see, most of you are working in a resettlement agency, and there are a few folks from community-based organizations and also schools and or universities. So we have a very diverse group here, and I'm sure that you will be able to contribute when we get to question and answer. Let's do another poll. In a minute or few seconds, please tell us about yourself by selecting the options that best describe you.
Great, thanks everyone for participating in this poll. We'll leave this one open just for about 10 more seconds.
Okay, so most of you, it shows that you have experience working with Afghan clients, or very frequently, but mostly you don't have. But still, you have some experience, so we can talk more a little bit talk more about it during the Q&A. And then the next one is, so take this poll and give us some information about this. Okay, so that's fine. So still, we see that you see the result. Hopefully by the end of this session, we will have some understanding how to deal with this group of newcomers. And can we move to, okay. So now Durana will talk about how, who are the new Afghan comers and how are different from other refugee groups. Durana?
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to begin by thanking you all for attending this webinar today. We're really looking forward to sharing our content with you and hope that it will be useful as you all work with the newcomers. So we'll begin by providing a brief overview of Afghan history and the various eras of migration to the US, then move into how this new period of Afghan migration is different so that you all have a good understanding of the context and conditions that have led to their recent displacement. After establishing that, we can talk about their social and cultural characteristics and provide tips on how to establish respectful relationships with them and provide services that align with their needs. So we can move on to the next slide. So we'll start with the Afghan community's presence in the US prior to 1978. So during this period, Afghanistan was relatively stable. Therefore, the majority of Afghans that were in the US were here as government employees or students. The first arrivals were typically wealthy, well-educated, and from Kabul. The Soviet Union's invasion in Afghanistan in 1979 sparked the first large-scale exodus from Afghanistan. The first arrivals in the US during the pre-1978 period were either stranded or sought political asylum. The individuals that came to the US after 1979 came mainly through the Family Reunification Program, which allows for people in the US to apply for their eligible family members to come to the US as refugees through the United States Refugee Admissions Program. This group was less affluent and less educated, sometimes from Kabul, but more often from other cities. The Soviet troops then left Afghanistan 10 years later in 1989 and provided the opportunity for the Taliban extremist group to claim control over the country in 1994, during which they imposed repressive social structures on Afghans. This specific period led to several large waves of refugees and asylum seekers, but very few of them found their way to the US. Those that did arrive came as family-sponsored immigrants. Overall, though, the number of Afghans residing in the US grew from 4,000 to 45,000 between 1980 and 2000. In 2001, resettlement in the US felt nearly impossible because of the various security measures implemented after the September 11 attacks, which effectively reduced the refugee admissions quotas. Very few Afghans were able to resettle in the US until 2008 with the creation of the Special Immigrant Visas, SIVs, that granted a path to permanent residence for Afghans who helped the US as well as their immediate family members. The number of Afghans in the US increased significantly after this period. While the numbers vary year by year, in 2019, the Afghan population in the US was at about 132,000, and 60% arrived in 2010 or later. Unfortunately for this new group of newcomers, we don't have a fully concrete understanding of the data about their characteristics just yet, but we can give you all what we do have. You can also save any specific questions for the Q&A portion. So these newcomers are largely coming under humanitarian parolee status. The gender of new arrivals is relatively evenly split, with more males than females. The primary languages for most new arrivals are Pashto and Dari, fairly evenly split between the two, with a very small number speaking Uzbeki, Turkmen, Farsi, and Pashai as their primary language. And many arrivals are children and youth, including a large number of children under 5. Currently, Afghans are arriving to the US in large numbers as a result of the Taliban's return to power and the majority are resettled in states like California, Texas, Oklahoma, Washington State, and Arizona for reasons like the personal connections they may already have living in those states, the presence of resettlement agencies in the states, the amount of job openings, and more affordable housing. So we can move on to the next slide. So what exactly caused this humanitarian crisis? Many Afghans have already left, tens of thousands have arrived in the US, and tens of thousands more will continue to arrive in the next year. In order for us all to understand how to better support the newcomers, we should be aware of the conditions that have led to their displacement and need for resettlement in the US. So the US withdrawal in August 2021 provided the Taliban with the opportunity to regain control of the country. As the current government, they are focusing on the minutiae of everyday life, like enforcing that everyone complies with the right Islamic attire and the lengths of men's beards, instead of ensuring that they uphold the basic human rights of their citizens and creating a plan to stop the country from falling into economic disrepair. While they claim that they will not repeat the harsh rule of their previous reign, it's evident that they will not uphold these commitments, as women are already being erased from all aspects of public life. Girls over the age of 12 are not allowed to go to school. School curriculum is being changed significantly to reflect Taliban's emphasis on Sharia. Minorities are being targeted, killed, and evicted from their land. The media is being suppressed and journalists are being violated, and the economy has been so severely weakened to the point that it's expected for 97% of the population to fall under the poverty line in the coming months. Not to mention that all of these issues will get much worse in the next few weeks as winter approaches and the drought continues. Next slide. So I must preface this section by saying that the benefits and services that come with each of these legal statuses are changing often. I can give you all a general understanding of the definitions of each and the general associated benefits, but I will also include links to helpful documents, or Meg will, in the chat. You might also be able to ask individuals that are more knowledgeable on this topic later during the Q&A portion. So Afghan evacuees are coming through different immigration options. So first is the special immigrant visas, which I mentioned earlier on. The SIV visa program is available to Afghan nationals who are employed by the US government or a contractor with direct funding from the US government or ISAF in Afghanistan for at least 1 year. This program is intended to allow those who qualify and their direct family members to apply directly to the US for resettlement. They do not have to wait for a UNHCR referral. Refugees may also arrive under the P2 program. A P2 designation means that this is a group of special concern to the US government. P2 includes Afghanistan nationals who worked in Afghanistan for a US government-funded program, a US-based media organization, or a non-governmental organization. These individuals would qualify for the SIV program, but do not need to meet the minimum 1 year time in service required for SIV. In regards to SI-SQ parolees, these are people with pending special immigrant visa applications. The SQ code refers to immigrant visa holders who are Iraqis and Afghans employed by US government, new arrivals. The SI code refers to immigrant visa holders who are special immigrant interpreters who are nationals of Iraq or Afghanistan. As for humanitarian parole, so humanitarian parole is a temporary status allowing the parolee to stay in the United States for a set period of time while applying for a longer-term solution. This is the status that most incoming Afghans will have. Most people with humanitarian parole will likely be seeking asylum in the US. Under current law, parolees are able to apply for work authorization and are eligible for ORR services. There may be policy changes in the future that will change the way that Afghan parolees are able to change their status. People who arrive with humanitarian status may eventually apply for asylum. A person can apply for asylum from within the US or at a US port of entry. A person can seek asylum in the United States if they meet the definition of a refugee. People who are approved for asylum can access the same benefits as refugees and SIVs. We can now discuss a few case scenarios, and to do so, I will hand that back over to Dr. Saydee.
Okay, thank you. So as you know, when Afghan government collapsed and there was a chaos as military plane started the evacuation. To give you a context, I have provided 3 case scenarios. The first one is showing a family. Meg, can we? Okay, good, thank you. The first one is this one is showing a family that were just evacuated without undergoing the strict process. This family was able to make it on to a plane headed to the US. Now they are at a military base in the United States and waiting for admissions processing. They're concerned whether they're eligible for benefits and services as they receive different information from multiple sources. The next case, can we go to next slide, please?
Before moving on, I'll just pause for a moment. We had a couple questions about moving a little, or comments about moving a little too quickly. So I'll just give a second or two to review the case scenario for those who are interested.
Okay, so this is a case of so as you know that there was a chaos, and once the government collapsed, military personnel and police and airport personnel, security personnel, everyone just disappeared, and the airport was just open to everyone, and the military plane went to the airfield and started evacuation. And at that time, there was no processing, no checking documents, and nothing. And anyone that could get onto a plane could leave Afghanistan. And this scenario talks about a family that was in this situation. And now they're in the United States. They're waiting inside the bases to be processed for admission. And there's a lot of uncertainty about their situations. And they receive information from multiple sources, some of accurate, some of inaccurate, and they're really concerned about the benefits that they're getting. Especially, some of them have heard that they receive only 1 month housing, and after that, if they get more help with housing, it will be cut from their cash benefits. And with employment, they're concerned with future of their education. So they have a lot of questions. And then when they reach to authorities for questions, I think the authorities also do not have a clear information to provide to them. So they're concerned when I talk to them. Okay, can we go to the next one? So the next family, the second family or the next family is those individuals that are undergoing the legal process of resettlement. For example, one of these family, they had a friend in the United States who was able to sponsor them, and the family was under the threat, and if they were staying in Afghanistan, they were facing persecution. Husband and wife, and they traveled to Pakistan via Kandahar, and right now they're in Quetta, Pakistan, waiting authorization to travel to Islamabad, and from there to the United States. So fortunately for this couple, the borders were open, and also at that time they were able to cash some money from banks and then cover the cost of their travel. And also with this particular family, because the wife belonged to Kandahar, and she was able to speak Pashto, although they had some issues during their trip to Pakistan, with checkpoints and a lot of interrogation by Taliban, but they were able to make it to Pakistan. Now they are waiting there to receive information from the US government and move to Islamabad, and then from there fly to the United States. The next one, please.
Great. And once more, I'll just give it maybe 10 minutes, or excuse me, 10 seconds for anyone who wants to take a final look at this scenario before we move on.
Yeah.
While you do, just for anyone who's joined recently, I'll share again that today's training is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording as well as to all materials that we share via email. So no need to copy any materials that you get from us today. We will share that all with you afterwards.
In the next group, or the third and most vulnerable group of individuals, are those who do not have anyone to sponsor them. They also do not have the financial means to apply themselves, because they can apply for themselves, but because of the cost that is involved with the application fee and also the cost that involved to go to the second country that is beyond their financial means. Plus, banks are not fully operational, and they have limitations to how much they can withdraw from banks if they have money in the bank. And plus, government employees, and they have not received their salaries for the past 3 to 4 months. So this is this group of people. They're hopeless, and they're living in fear without any certainty for their future. So I think now we can do another poll. So if you can take a few seconds to tell us what needs and concerns have Afghan newcomers share with you if you have worked with them. Do we have some results? Okay. Yes, they're really valid concerns. And when I talk with family members and also some friends and some Afghans, and that they are in this process, they share the same concerns, and these are valid concerns. And next, we can take another poll. If you could take a few seconds to tell us what needs and concerns have Afghan newcomers share with you. I think you have already did that, and I think, yes.
Sorry about that. I was a little slow to advance the slide.
No, okay, that's fine. Sometimes technology. Yeah, what strengths have you encountered among Afghan newcomers if you have worked with them?
Great. Thanks all for your participation in this poll. Let's go ahead and close that now.
Okay. So yes, resilience and strong family ties and communities. These are, yes, I as an Afghan American, I can talk and confirm that. And you have not worked with, so that's fine. So we will share with you some of information regarding this topic later on. Okay. And now Durana will talk about serving Afghan newcomers with cultural awareness.
Okay, I hope that was helpful and descriptive enough for you all to now have a good understanding of the history and context that have led these newcomers to come to the US. We're now going to talk about some social and cultural customs among Afghans. Before we do, keep in mind that cultural awareness does not mean you know everything there is to know about a particular culture, which is impossible. Instead, you should strive to 1, focus on the individual. This allows individuals to explore their feelings, beliefs, and behaviors, work through challenges, and identify aspects of their lives that they would like to talk about. Be open-minded and become a good listener. 2, avoid making assumptions. Ask good questions and be mindful and respectful. For example, there is often an incorrect assumption that clients from Afghanistan, especially SIV holders, speak English. So please avoid making any assumptions like that or like anything else. 3, ask when uncertain. The Afghan situation is complex and there are many unknowns. Many people are responding with uncertainty just as you are. If your role involves providing ongoing support to Afghan clients, you may need to respectfully ask questions or conduct an assessment to find out more about race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, social class, abilities, etc., as relevant to your role. And the final thing, prioritize learning and keeping an open mind. I'm now going to pass this back over to Dr. Saydee to describe in greater detail the multiple social and cultural characteristics that we found to be the most relevant when engaging with Afghan newcomers.
Thank you. The first thing that we want to talk is about language. You probably already know and also heard during this presentation that Dari and Pashto are the two official languages of Afghanistan. And every Afghan is expected to speak at least one of them. Dari refers to varying dialects of Persian language spoken in Afghanistan. It is the lingua franca of Afghanistan. The name Farsi was officially changed to Dari by the Afghan government in 1964. However, Afghans still use the name Dari and Farsi interchangeably to refer to their native language. So in the context of Afghan in Afghanistan, Farsi means Dari. It does not mean Iranian Persian. This information is important because when we need an interpreter for Dari speaking Afghans, there is a possibility that sometimes we pretend that Farsi is that Farsi that is spoken in Iran. So that's different. So when they say Farsi, they mean Dari, which is spoken in Afghanistan. There is also a possibility that some Pashtuns who have left in Dari-speaking areas of Afghanistan may feel more comfortable speaking in Dari Farsi. This means that we should not assume an individual's political, religious, tribal, regional affiliation based on the language that they speak. Also, it is essential to ask them which language they prefer and feel more comfortable communicating in. The next topic is religion. You know that the majority of Afghans are Muslims, and Afghans vary in their practice of their religion. Some are more rigorous, praying 5 times a day, maintaining halal food practices, and dressing to cover their head to toes. Others are more relaxed. Islam is divided into 2 major sects of Sunni and Shia, which were born primarily because of a dispute over political succession rather than religious differences. About 85% of Afghans are Sunni and 14% of Shia or Shiites, and the remaining percent are just minorities. Hazaras, which account for 90% of population, are predominantly Shiite. Most people in provinces bordering Iran, such as Herat and Farah, are also Shia. Thus, in addition to Hazaras, there are pockets of Tajiks and Pashtun Shiites as well. Under the Taliban, Shiites are believed to have been persecuted because of their beliefs. For example, the recent mosque suicide bombings in Kunduz and Kandahar that killed hundreds of Shiite Afghans confirm these claims. Although ISIS took the responsibility of bombings, but to an ordinary Afghan, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or Daesh and Taliban are the same, as they fight for the same ideology. And now we can talk a little bit about diet in Islam. Islam bans the consumption of alcohol and eating the meat of swine and that of animals and that have been slaughtered improperly. Improperly means not by a Muslim or not by someone who has said Allah Akbar when slaughter the animal. Some Afghan Muslims are strict and some are more relaxed. For example, some may eat McDonald's chicken and beef sandwiches, and some may consider McDonald's sandwiches as haram or something that's prohibited. So therefore, it would be always good practice to inform families whether the food is halal or haram, as well as describing the ingredients of an edible item before consuming it, such as gelatin, which comes from pig skin. If possible, introduce local halal meat shops and restaurants to them. We can talk about ethnic group tensions. Afghanistan is a diverse country, consists of over 20 different ethnic groups, including Pashtuns, Tajik, Hazaras, Qizilbash, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and many more. The most intense ethnic tension exists between the Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. The past 20 years of democratic government in Afghanistan a new constitution offered an opportunity for all ethnic groups to raise their voices and concerns openly. However, instead of bringing harmony among different Afghan ethnic groups, such an opportunity increased the rift between them. This is important to note that these inter-ethnic tensions do not disappear upon leaving Afghanistan. Instead, they are intensified based on unconfirmed reports that I have heard. Afghan American interpreters may discriminate against newcomers of different ethnic backgrounds. In order to ease these tensions, service providers should be familiar with these inter-ethnic tensions or how these inter-ethnic tensions operate both in Afghanistan and upon resettlement. It will be ideal to pair up interpreters and families of on these and similar basis. It is important to pair up interpreters and families on the basis of similar culture and language backgrounds to ensure there is no opportunity for discrimination between interpreters and newcomers, or establish at least a clear policy and guidelines for interpreters to follow. Next, we can talk about family structure. As in the United States, a family is the most important institution in Afghan society. Within families, there is a tendency toward respect for age. Disobedience of an elder is considered a disrespectful act. In Afghanistan, families are large and multi-generational. Of course, living in big families has its advantages and disadvantages. One of the benefits of living in large household is that families receive support from each other, whether it is house chore or financial support and other type of support. Unfortunately, they lose those advantages when they resettle in a country where individualism is the norm. Role and responsibilities are defined along traditional roles. Men have the responsibility of providing for the entire family, and they make the final decisions. Women are in charge mostly inside the house or house chores, and they're mostly doing cooking, cleaning, washing, and raising children. Afghan culture is male dominated, and women are expected to obey the male member of their family. That's father, elder brother, husband, so on. In most cases, it is normal for women to be yelled at and face other sort of domestic violence. So when families come to the United States, it may take time to understand what is okay and what is considered domestic violence. They would need time and multiple cultural orientations to integrate into the US culture. It is important point that they should know that ignorance of the law is no excuse. Education, we can talk about traditional and modern education. The traditional and informal education includes a teaching about Islam, which mostly takes place in mosques and madrasas or religious boarding schools. Formal education or modern education was introduced or granted free for grade 1 to 6 in the Constitution of 1964. The fall of the Taliban in 2001 brought an atmosphere of excitement, expectations, and determination in schools throughout the country. After the decades of neglect and stagnation, schools enrollment jumped several folds. However, currently, in addition to other things, the Taliban believe that the current curriculum is not well aligned with Islamic principles and it is less valuable. Taliban believe that religious studies better serves the country's needs and interests, and the current curriculum must be replaced with the religious curriculum taught in madrasas or religious schools. As an example, the Taliban's acting high education minister, Abdul Baqi Haqqani, said that qualifications earned in the past 20 years are of no use to the country. One of the reasons that Afghans leave Afghanistan is that they do not see any future for their children there. While every parent wants their children to succeed academically and professionally, sometimes parents and children's goals and definitions of success mismatch. In most cases, Afghan parents want their daughters and their sons to become physicians, engineers, lawyers, and so on. Usually, parents push their desire on their children, which may create a backlash. Therefore, it is important that parents receive a comprehensive orientation on how to be engaged in their children's education and help them to succeed academically. The next topic that we can talk is about occupation and social status. Excuse me. Professionals are generally divided into two categories of prestige jobs and low prestige, high prestige jobs and low prestige jobs. Prestige jobs include being a teacher, professor, doctor, engineer, government, high-ranking employees, and so on. And low prestige jobs include barber, cook, singer, dancer, etc. With high prestige jobs, people like to be recognized. However, people will feel insulted if they are called or identified with low prestige jobs. For example, calling someone a barber is considered an offensive act. Employment is a vital step in the process of resettlement toward financial stability. Afghan newcomers come from different spheres of life. In most cases, they expect to get similar jobs they had in Afghanistan in the United States. It is, excuse me. It is imperative to spend some quality time with employment individuals to develop a realistic individual employment plans, short-term and long-term. In addition, families must know that the stigma attached to some jobs in Afghanistan does not exist in the United States. For example, a paycheck does not reveal an employee's job title. They should also be realistic about what they want to do. I'm referring to their first job. Families should also understand that forcing their opinions on their children regarding what field to study and what profession to pursue may not bring positive outcomes. It is good to be engaged in their children's education and provide them advice and guidance, but they should not force their children against their will. Social institutions, generally, all social institutions have been interrupted at this time. People refrain from social gatherings. And now Durana can talk about mental health.
Right. So I wanted to preface this section by saying that we luckily have mental health experts on our panel today, and it might be incredibly helpful for you all to keep that in mind if you have any questions specifically on mental health concerns for this population, to ask them during the Q&A portion. But overall, Afghan newcomers are at great risk for developing mental disorders. Traumatic experiences and post-migration living difficulties account for a large proportion of mental distress in this population, making them susceptible to illnesses like PTSD, depression, and/or anxiety. Some mental health concerns might even be taboo for them to talk about. For service providers, it is incredibly important to include specific training in the delivery of culturally sensitive mental health services. Also, the role of gender is critical in this community, like we mentioned earlier on. Health professionals should be educated around the need to use gender-specific interpreters to allow women to discuss confidential issues that may be taboo for them to raise in the presence of male interpreters and/or children. And last but not least, it's vital to describe the importance of material culture in Afghanistan, and also especially the roles of music, art, and dance. The Taliban poses a direct threat to Afghanistan's cultural heritage. Music, art, and dance are integral to Afghan culture and are used to celebrate important life milestones. These are also very important tools for second-generation Afghan Americans when it comes to maintaining their ethnic heritage, as many second-generation Afghan Americans feel the most Afghan when they're listening to Afghan music or performing the traditional Attend dance, which is considered to be the national dance of Afghanistan. So it's valuable to keep this in mind while you work with these newcomers, knowing that culture extends beyond mannerisms and customs and can bleed into things like music and dance for these newcomers. We can move on to the next slide.
So now let's take a few seconds to type what other social and cultural characteristics of Afghan newcomers should refugee service providers be aware of. Meg, can you facilitate this part, please?
Great. Yes, thanks all for all your great questions so far. So you just heard Farid and Durana discuss several different social and cultural characteristics. I'm going to put a link in the chat now for you to share any others that you think are important for everyone today to be aware of. So you can go to slido.com and enter the code you see on your screen, or you can click on the link here and you can share your responses. And we'll just take a minute or two for this activity. Great, we see quite a few coming through now. All right, let's turn off this poll. So you'll no longer be able to submit a response, but we can take a look at some of the responses that we've received. We saw several responses related to gender dynamics. I think I saw motherhood go by as one. I see another reminder, as Durana mentioned earlier, to focus on the individual. I know you all can't see all the responses here, so just flagging a few that jump out to me. Questions related to intelligence or to education. Yes, absolutely. Importance of music and dance. And some other questions around engaging with families or clients. So respectful greeting, etiquette, taking shoes off, shaking hands. I think we'll get into this next. So hopefully we can learn a little bit more in this area. Great, thank you all for those responses.
Yes, definitely. There are great points, and some of them we will cover during this presentation, but some of them maybe during Q&A to talk about it. So next, we talk about transitioning to a US culture. And the first thing that I want to talk is about expectations and misconceptions. So as you can say that expectations circle around good housing, mostly about good housing and about good paying jobs. Some of their expectations are due to misconceptions and information from their families, friends, and some unreliable sources. They believe that they have valuable transferable skills which can help them get high-paying jobs almost immediately. Well, of course, while transferring their skills and finding their desired jobs as possible, it may not be achievable and in short term or immediately. Therefore, they must have an accurate and realistic picture of the process that they will go through on their path to resettlement. And now let's talk about high context and low context culture. Culture, you know that culture plays an important role in communication because people convey their information, feeling, and ideas through words, facial expressions, and gestures. People provide a different range of information, in other words, context, based on their cultural backgrounds. Thus, high context and low context culture is mostly divided based on communication styles and the amount of information provided. In low context culture, for example, United States or American culture, communication is mostly done explicitly. Therefore, meaning is conveyed mostly through spoken words. People are more in favor of efficient use of time in communication, in communication, such as schedule and promptness. Individual in this culture deliver the message directly, and they quickly get to the point. Whereas in high context culture, Afghan culture, physical context carries most of the meaning, which indicates that people in high context talks around a point without explicitly saying it until the listener understand the message correctly. High context people take longer time in order to establish trust, relationships, and common understandings between the speaker and listener. People from high context culture, Afghans, focus more on non-verbal aspect of communication, that is facial expression, behavior, and gestures of the speaker, rather than the speaker's verbal message. Communication among low context culture, like Americans, is more direct and non-personal. They adjust with new situations easily compared to people from high context culture. Also, people from low context culture withdraw from a relationship or business dealing quicker compared to the people from high context culture, if things are not working well. In addition, people from from a low context culture, like Americans, they confront each other to express and defend their opinions, whereas people from high context culture are more socially oriented and less confrontational. It is hard for them to say no. They try to not show their disagreement in public as much as possible because it is considered offensive and cause loss of face for the other individual. Not being able to decode indirect messages of people from high context culture may lead to misunderstanding of the message and perceive improper. Misinterpretation occurs when influence of culture is ignored and people use their own culture as a basis to construct meanings. Durana can talk about the next topic, please.
Yeah, so in Afghanistan, people emphasize the needs and goals of the group as a whole over the needs and desires of the individual. So people are connected in a community and or within large family structures and in a collectivist culture. So family members take care of one another and are responsible for one another for entire lifetimes. This transition might be incredibly difficult for newcomers coming to the United States. Here, newcomers typically arrive either individually or with their immediate family members. They no longer have the support of their extended family or community members. Therefore, they're most susceptible to feeling lonely and overwhelmed by the lack of help they had once received in Afghanistan. It will also be difficult in general transitioning to a culture that emphasizes individual goals, and therefore service providers should be aware of how to offer services that help ease this transition and provide solutions like offering extensive childcare while parents look for work and provide them with opportunities to build community with co-ethnics, whether that looks like resettling them in a city with a significant Afghan population or pointing them in the direction of ethnic spaces and institutions. We can move on to the next slide.
Okay. So now we can talk about etiquette and social norms. And I saw some of the notes that you put in that chat. So it kind of like touch up on some of these things that I want to talk about. And so the first thing is greeting. When we greet, it is preferred to use right hand or two hands together. Male should avoid offering handshake with female unless they extend their hands. And also it is it's a good practice to avoid touching people of the opposite gender. Hospitality is an important part of Afghan culture. When When you visit a family, it is recommended to take off your shoes at the door and wait to be guided to the room where you sit. Usually men and women eat and socialize separately. But if they are in the same room, it is best to sit next to someone of the same gender. If you are invited to an Afghan house, please do not give alcohol or any product of pork as gift to Afghans. Discussing business and finance. So, because we talked that the Afghans are more in kind of like a different culture, Afghan men may be more comfortable talking about financial matters with women. However, women may not be comfortable in doing so with, may not be comfortable in doing so with a man, but they may be comfortable in doing so with a female service provider. And overall, please remember to be patient and keep your focus on serving all members of the case respectfully. Another point is to dress modestly when meeting an Afghan. Punctuality in Afghanistan, it is okay to be late or not showing up or showing up at someone's office or house without any prior notice. Therefore, it is very important that the newcomers understand the importance of time and punctuality in the US culture. So you can provide some explanation and also concrete examples to help them better understand the concept. Communication, we already talked about verbal communication. We can talk about nonverbal communication in this slide. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay. The nonverbal communication. So for nonverbal communication, as we mentioned, that they are in high context and culture, so they pay more attention to body gestures and facial expression and all those things. So control your emotion like anger, particularly losing one's temper can cause Afghans to lose respect. Keep your distance and avoid close contact. Winking indicates that there is a secret motive. Please avoid doing that. Thumbs up. Originally, it was considered an impolite gestures. However, now most Afghans understand that thumbs up indicates agreement or something being okay. Come here, go away. For this, please don't use your index finger, use your entire arm. And we can talk about some do's. Be sensitive to the experience that Afghans newcomers have endured. And there is a high occurrence of anxiety, depression, PTSD among those that have witnessed and lost their family. Please remember that most of them, they just locked the doors of their houses and ran toward the airport. They left behind almost everything, and like houses, properties, and all belongings. There are some unconfirmed reports that indicates that Taliban confiscate houses whose owners are not in Afghanistan. So this adds to their depression and anxiety. Offer sympathy regarding current situation in Afghanistan. Afghans appreciate kind gestures and respond with warmth, but please do not ask details of their personal experience. Be aware of, again, of inter-ethnicities tensions to the extent possible. Team up Dari and Pashto interpreters with Afghan newcomers based on their common shared ethnicity, language, and culture in order to avoid any possible discrimination. Be aware that the individuals who have been targeted of religious persecution may prefer not to discuss faith. Some don'ts. Avoid discussing sensitive topics, for example, ethnic tensions, politics, the Taliban, with Afghans, unless they initiate it. In that case, it will be fine. Do not assume that all Afghans equally practice the teaching of Islam. praying five times, all women wear hijab, etc. Do not use English, idioms, and sophisticated language. Stick to plain English to avoid any misinterpretation, misunderstanding. Do not lose your patience and temper while helping the families through the process of their resettlement. And with this, we're done with this presentation, and now we can open to panel discussions. Meg? Please.
Great. Thank you so much for this informative presentation, Farid and Durana. I've noted several questions in the Q&A throughout, so we'll do our best to get to all of them. But for all the participants here who have many specific questions to your individual program or location, just bear in mind that we'll likely not be able to get through everything today. So I'm so pleased to introduce our three guest panelists in addition to Farid and Durana today. First, Haris Tarin, Senior Advisor to Operation Allies Welcome. We're also joined by Rosalind Ghafar Rogers, Subject Matter Expert and Mental Health Consultant with USCRI, as well as Wais Khairandesh, Mental Health Therapist. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. As we continue to review the questions that are coming in, I think I'll start with one that we received in our pre-registration and one that I saw a few people mention here today for Haris, which is what can you tell us about the demographics of the population that are currently on the bases in the US?
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm unable to turn on my camera as of yet, but just wanted to make sure. Are you able to hear me properly?
We can, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to thank you all for having me this afternoon and for the presentation, the cultural competency presentation as well. I do want to start off by saying, having interacted with this current population, we have about 78,000 Afghan friends, allies, and evacuees who have arrived in the United States, and we have about 54,000 of them who are on the various military bases around the country. Having gone to the bases, interacted with hundreds of thousands of them. One thing I will say, population, it is a population that have broad cultural habits and perspectives. It's also important to know that this population is extremely diverse. It is a population that consists of course, males and females, various ethnic background, various religious practice. Some of them are progressive, some of them are more traditional. So it is an extremely diverse group of folks who have lived in Afghanistan the past 20 years and have experienced in Afghanistan that had some openness and some freedoms that they enjoyed. But we also have a population who comes from the rural parts of Afghanistan, who had not experienced city life, and who had not experienced the openness of the past 20 years in Afghanistan. So I think that's the first thing that I think we all need to ensure that we understand. It is a diverse group of folks that we're dealing with. We're also dealing with a group of folks that will have challenges when it comes to language skills. The past 10 years, the SIV population, as was mentioned, who came to this country generally spoke English. There were translators, there were interpreters, there were those who had language capabilities. What we see amongst this group is some of course, of those individuals who have language capabilities, but we do have a large number of our parolees, of our guests who are here who don't speak the English language. So providing a interpretation and engagement with language accessibility issues, that's going to be extremely important for this group as we help them integrate into American life. Number three, I think it's important for us to understand that this is a group that has gone through an immense amount of trauma. The trauma of almost 40 years of war, consistent war, and then the trauma of having to leave their country overnight with the clothes on their back. They rush to the airport, were able to get on a flight. They've left spouses behind, they've left parents behind, they've left children behind, they've left siblings behind, they've left homes, and who was the chief of staff of a senior government agency who literally left everything behind. And so to understand that these individuals, they had belongings, they had a life, work. They are not just individuals who kind of didn't have anything and decided to move out overnight. People, folks that have gone through an immense amount of trauma, they have gone through an immense amount of loss. So I think engagement with this group of individuals, making sure that
Haris, I apologize. Your audio's coming in and out.
We're doing it in a manner where we respect the dignity of these individuals. Is this better?
You know, it's okay, but we got a few distortions, but I think we got the main points that you shared. Should we maybe take a pause and come back to you?
And then I'll join you from a more stable.
That would be great. So sorry about that. All right, so while Haris works on maybe clearing up any of those audio issues, we'll take another question. And thank you, Haris, for those recommendations. I think that that's a very key point around the diversity of this population and some of those considerations you raised. So I see that we do have, we saw from our poll earlier, several teachers or other educators on the line today, and I see a few questions from those interested in supporting Afghan students and parents in a school setting. Wais, is that a question that you may have some recommendations on?
Hello, yes. Good morning or afternoon to each of you, depending on where you're at in this world. But thank you all so much for joining us. I'm grateful to each and every one of you. Yes, as far as there's some recommendations that might help assist teachers and other school admin and staff members kind of and bringing in and helping the Afghan children and adolescents have a better transition to the system. Because I haven't gone through it myself when I was 10 years old up until where I'm at now. So it's significant to keep in mind everything that we've talked about as far as it goes in terms of the role that somebody's family and the culture and all those play in the role. Particularly when it comes to school, it's quite necessary to make sure that there's a few different things that I've written down that we should be able to keep in mind. One of the main things is to make sure that and this is something that's a little bit difficult depending on where they'll start in their journey, both in terms of what class they might start, what kind of schooling they may go into. But whoever's assigned, having one particular individual assigned to a child is quite significant. And that individual could kind of go on and introduce them to the other teachers and school counselors, tutors, coaches. There needs to be that one person that they can always kind of go back to as like the reference point, someone that they can kind of hold on and anchor to and have that familiarity and that trust. Because many children that do come into here, thankfully, as a result of the need and the resources, individual schools want to provide them with appropriate resources, but that includes bringing in different agencies, different tutors, different coaches, and then speech therapists and counselors. And the individual haven't already gone through the journey that they've gone through meeting individuals. And for me, it was difficult to have to go from one individual to the other without really knowing, without having appropriate introduction. So kind of having always that warm handoff to the children as it relates to kind of getting them accustomed to their culture of the school and also to who they'll meet. And then really encouraging things like, after school curricular activities and sports and other arts and things that they can take part in, because that's something quite foreign to individuals going up there. There's very, very little of that. And so, but in doing that, making sure that you involve the family and have the parents say, hey, this is something that is as part of the school, we encourage your kid to do this, and kind of involving them into the process without just saying, hey, no, you're showing up to practice, it doesn't matter, it's part of the requirement. So those are significant as it relates to just a few of the things, given the traumatic background of the students, is making sure that you warn them about things like fire drills as sound and just that without notice, those noises can be quite traumatic and impactful. So I know that most times we have to kind of keep that secret when it's routine to take them on a fire drill, but it's something as simple as like that, it's not really seen as like routine or practice. So giving them heads up when it comes to something like that, it is quite necessary. And then if you're a teacher, making sure that, and even a principal, kind of educating the rest of the individuals in the school, within the classroom, to integrate the individual student into the classroom, so that they don't feel a sense of having to do this and learn and accustomed to the culture and the education system all by themselves. Even assigning them somebody, a peer student, to kind of have them kind of for the first few months kind of go around, introduce them to others, and if they have any questions, they come back to them. That also kind of enhances cohesiveness within the classroom. So those are something significant. And lastly, as it relates to the education aspect of it, making sure that if you do have a school counselor, like you introduce the student to them, hopefully they'll get assistance outside of school counselors. And having been a school counselor, there's very limited things that we could do that individuals can do. But needing to introduce them to the school counselors and what they can do, what they can't do, is quite significant. So those are just three main points that I wanted to kind of keep you all keep in mind. Of course, there's much more, but the time is limited because we do have more questions here.
Thank you so much for those great suggestions. And I see a few resources being shared via Q&A there. I know, Wais, you've been kind enough to speak on some prior training specific to that area of engaging with students and parents. And I know there is at least one other training coming up in that area. So those materials are all indexed on the Switchboard website, those external trainings. So if anyone's interested in this, diving in deeper, please check out our website for the links to those. So I did notice mental health. I think we discussed mental health a few times so far today, and I noticed this is coming up a few times in our Q&A. I'm wondering, Rosalind, if you can share a little bit about the work you're engaged in as far as mental health currently, as well as some of the key mental health considerations for this population.
Sure. So first, thank you for having me and for everyone attending. As Meg had described earlier, I am working with USCRI to develop and implement mental health programs at all of the bases. So right now we've started at 3, hopefully expanding to the others. And I want to preface this with the fact that the mental health presentation, at least at the military bases for the Afghans versus once they get into the community and they're resettled, is going to be very, very different. So typically the mental health issues that come up at the bases are typically underrepresented compared to later on during their journey. So in terms of what's been seen at the bases, I would say typical symptoms of, PTSD, depression. There's a lot of psychosomatic issues that are going on. So they typically present at the medical center with various somatic complaints. Once they're checked out, obviously they're referred over to a psychologist or a mental health practitioner that then treats them for depression or trauma. Typically, I would say on the basis, trauma and really deep level issues are not being addressed because it's just they have such a lack of control over their environment and over their lives, and they're dealing with getting their needs met. So that's typically not something that we would recommend, at least at the military bases. I think that the trauma may be something that can be addressed once they're resettled, once they've gotten things more settled in their lives. So we're also seeing with the children, there's a lot of aggression, so a lot of externalizing behaviors with the children. And I think that's just a lack of like daily routine and structure, obviously, and obviously, you know, everything that they've been through, as well as the fact that their parents are stressed out and are probably less available to them than typically, you know, they typically have been. So I think that's there's some rare cases of psychosis, but nothing significant. And again, that could be, you know, due to the trauma that they've experienced. The biggest thing that I've heard over and over again from volunteering at the expo, as well as being at the base, is family separation. The situation at, you know, during the evacuation, there's just children left behind, you know, sisters, brothers. I mean, it's just the entire family's just been completely separated. And so that's a huge concern for them. So that's, I think, one thing to keep in mind. And you know, as long as they are separated, that will be an ongoing concern for them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rosalind. So if I may direct a question to Farid, a clarifying question. I see several participants were interested in a review of the information you shared about the difference between Dari, Farsi, and Pashto. Do you mind repeating that information?
Yes, of course. The name of the language and that's spoken in Afghanistan. First, Dari is a dialect of Persian. So we know that Persian, Tajik, that's spoken in Tajikistan, Tajik or Tajiki, and Dari, and different dialect of Dari in Afghanistan. They're all the same language that comes under the mother language, mother Persian. And the dialect that is spoken in Iran, it's called Farsi these days. But in the past, the language in Afghanistan, the Dari was also called Farsi. And but when people say Farsi, they refer to the dialect that is common and spoken in Afghanistan. So in 1964, the government changed the name of Farsi to Dari. So basically, when you see, for example, a family and you ask them that what language do you speak, they say Farsi. So when they say Farsi, the point is that please do not assume that they talk about the Farsi that is spoken in Iran. And that's why sometimes because the problem is that Iranian mostly they may not be able to communicate with Afghans who live in rural areas. Of course, inside the cities, for example, for Kabul, they can understand each other, but the people in the Afghan villages, they speak Dari, they may not understand what the Iranian tells them. So these two dialects are a little bit different. Did I answer your question?
I believe so. Yes, thank you. So to your point on, you know, culturally appropriate service providers and linguistically appropriate interpreters, I saw a few questions here on, you know, how can we overcome challenges associated with trying to match a client's preferred service provider with the characteristics that client brings? So for example, if you're serving a female client who might prefer a female service provider, logistically that can be quite challenging. I'm wondering if any of our panelists may have any recommendations for how we might support those type of requests in a way that makes clients most comfortable while considering those logistical constraints.
Can briefly address that, Megan. I think one of the ways, especially in the current COVID environment, and also just the logistical challenges of getting interpreters, especially one of the challenges that we've had at Operation Allies Welcome and on the 8 bases is getting female translators and then female Pashto speaking translators. That's been one of the really acute challenges for us. In dealing with the current operation. What's been helpful for us is some of the telephonic translation services, virtual. So through the telephone, through Zoom, through virtual settings has really been one of the best ways for us to mitigate some of those challenges of having in-person translators. I would say still, I think we should make every effort to try to have in-person language appropriate interpreters. But if that is not a possibility, for instance, if we're, if we have a family that's resettling in Muncie, Indiana, that you probably will not be finding many female or even male Pashto interpreters who would be able to be on demand and on site to do interpretation. So telephonic and virtual interpretation has been something that we've been using in certain scenarios where we don't have anybody in person, and that has been quite helpful for us. So I think if there are services out there that are available, and if agencies are able to set up a virtual interpretation process, I think that would be extremely helpful.
Thank you so much for that suggestion, Haris, and your audio sounded much clearer, so that was much appreciated.
I think, sorry, to maybe add to that, in addition to what Haris just mentioned, oftentimes when we were in the bases, there were family members who didn't speak, or individuals sitting in front of us that didn't speak English, but they had extended families, whether it was in Australia, the UK, places like that, where they said, hey, can they talk to you in English so that they can understand? And I know there's that, we live in a world of HIPAA and confidentiality and whatnot. But being as creative and as open as you can be, I know we ask the families to be as open-minded and as creative with their, what they're coming in with, but the same thing with the agencies. So if you are able to allow the individuals who have family members that are willing to talk and do the interpretation, maybe consider utilizing that. And then that also kind of cuts through the barrier of the male versus female diversion that's already there, and that could fill that gap, because if it's a male family member, it's not as much of a difficulty for them to open up and talk to you also. So that would be something else in addition to what Haris just mentioned, this in terms of the creativity of using technology.
Great, thank you so much, Wais. So continuing on through our Q&A, I see that the top question we have is regarding English language acquisition, which is what aspects of English grammar and phonetics pose problems for Afghan speakers? I'm not sure, Farid, if this may be a good question for you, or if any of our other panelists may like to chime in.
Can you repeat the question, please?
What aspects of English grammar and phonetics pose problems for Afghan speakers?
Well, I was looking at these questions, and I was trying to see that what aspects. I think it's grammar, focusing more on grammar at the beginning to communicate. That might make it a little bit harder for language learners to understand. So at the beginning, if the focus is on comprehensibility and providing everything in the context, that might help them to learn some English and then convey their messages. And later on, when they learn, then they can provide them with some grammar. There are also some areas that they transfer the grammatical rules from Persian or from Farsi, Dari or Pashto into English. That might be problematical. And apart from that, I can share some resources. I already shared the resource in the chat. If you can share it with everyone, and maybe I can share some resources to help them with this topic.
Great, thank you. So moving through, thank you all for such engaged questions through our Q&A period. I do see a question here regarding prejudice among clients who may be less familiar with interacting with people from other backgrounds. Would any of our panelists like to tackle how best to support clients in understanding the diversity that they may encounter in the US when it comes to service providers and addressing any discrimination that they may see?
One of the things that I can address quickly, and then I can let my colleagues take a more technical turn, but what we've seen on the bases and what I saw both internationally on our military bases outside of the US and domestically as well. And one of the things that we've actually created programming at Operation Allies Welcome to do on the bases is to actually identify and then report discrimination. The identifying and reporting discrimination is not a concept that is fully understood within the communities. As was mentioned in a part of the cultural competency presentation, the communities will generally try to stay away from any type of confrontation or creating problems or challenges. And so what we've tried to do is say, this is what discrimination looks like. This is what housing discrimination would be. This is what job discrimination is. This is what bullying of your kids at school would look like. So actually familiarizing the population, socializing the idea of discrimination, individual rights, civil rights, and human rights with the population is extremely important. So I think if agencies are engaging the population, there should be a level of awareness and training on what discrimination means and how to report discrimination. So if someone says, no, I'm not going to rent you this apartment because you're a refugee or because you look differently, you don't just let that go. There is a place to actually report that. If your kids are being bullied in school because of their religion or their ethnic background or the fact that they don't have language proficiency, you could report that to the principal, to the teacher, and that there should be no retaliation against you. And so these are concepts that I think we need to socialize. We've been trying to do some of that on the basis around the issues of domestic violence, reporting of domestic violence, reporting of child abuse, reporting of sexual assault, and then also all other forms of discrimination. I mean, we in general in America have a problem with reporting of hate crimes and discrimination with the whole population. So when you can imagine having a new population come in, not understanding laws and policies and procedures, they would even have a more acute challenge in identifying and then reporting. So I would suggest trainings on identifying and reporting discrimination be part of any engagement that happens.
Yeah, can I add maybe a little bit to that? So in a sense, those are the significant parts, and I think the third layer to that needs to be, well, what do we do about that afterwards, right? And then that's where a sense of empowerment comes in, and I'm sure the 1,700 participants we have here, that's probably where their mind is on. All right, we got to empower them to kind of speak up. Absolutely. But make sure that when you do that, there's this, you have to be very, very delicate and articulate with how you do it, because empowerment or having an individual speak up, and oftentimes, again, if it's against the family member or a friend or, somebody more powerful to them, they haven't really that's something that they recognize that's going to come back with consequences. And so when you do empower them, when you do let them know, making sure that you do it in a way that doesn't feel like they're pressured to go ahead and speak up, because the whole goal is to speak up and hopefully stop discrimination. But and one of the things that we all know along with war trauma and pain, that is, discrimination is one of the things that Afghans have gone through for quite a few decades. So it's nothing new to them when they do come here, and it's just an addition to what they've already known. And in a sense, unfortunately, it's almost normalized in their lives. But needing to make sure that when you do the empowering piece, it's in a way that doesn't cause them to feel like, hey, you're actually against me rather than with me or for me. Because I saw certain cases, unfortunately, in the bases where domestic violence and child abuse came up, and there needed to be, the victim speaking up. And when the individuals or us try to encourage them to speak up, it really came across as like, wait a minute, or why are you trying to get me into trouble for speaking up, when really our goal was the complete opposite. So and again, our mind automatically goes to that thought, like, hey, speak up, it's your right, and it is their right to speak up. But considering the culture, considering the consequences they face in the background, that's going to be the limiting factor, and needing to navigate through that is significant.
And Meg, I mean, that point by Wais is absolutely critical, I think, because when we ask people to speak up, especially vulnerable populations, right, whether that's women, children, minorities, people with disabilities, it can be, whatever vulnerable population that we talk about, if we don't provide them the resources, as Wais said, to be able to feel supported, we're actually creating a bigger challenge and problem for them within their support structures and networks. So if you have someone who is a victim of abuse, some type of domestic abuse, whether that's spousal or child abuse or elder abuse, whatever it may be, and we don't provide the social structures and resources to then be able to isolate them, give them support, give them resources, financial and physical and housing resources, we're actually creating larger issues. And we see that on the basis, as I said, it is a critical point. And I think if we're going to help ask people to feel empowered and speak up, then those services have to be there, those baseline services, for them to feel supported to continue.
Great. Thank you both for those responses. I
Right.
think we have time for...
Can I add something?
Sure.
I think these points are really really important, and but the problem is that sometimes we just talk about these problems like discrimination and domestic violence and harassment without providing some concrete examples in order to make sure that they understand. For example, sexual harassment, it comes in different forms, and it's not only physical, but also kind of like giving dirty comments or jokes or something that can also have consequences. So the problem with maybe not a problem, but the way that people think that, I mean, newcomers, that we are guests here and the law, everyone is sympathetic to us, and if we do something, they will not take it that serious. So it's very important that they should understand all these concepts, and also they should understand that once they're in the hands of law because of any wrongdoing, then there will be serious consequences. So prevention is better than treatment. So they should make sure that service provider make sure that they understand and the consequences and all those things, and to not get to that point.
Thank you for that additional point, Farid. So I see we're approaching our end time, but we may have time for one or two more questions, especially if any of our participants would like to stay on an extra minute or two. I see there's a lot of interest in gender. So in particular, this top question we have: in the US, there is a narrative of oppressed Afghan women, in quotes. How do Afghan women view this narrative? Is this something that's seen as offensive? And I know we discussed this a bit during the facilitated portion, but I wonder if Rosalind or Durana, you might like to speak about images of Afghan women in the US and any recommendations for gender-sensitive services.
Yeah, I think, again, with the Afghan population, I mean, it varies, and it's a spectrum. And I think that, I mean, you'll even find more rural Afghan women who have, what would seem in the Western culture as more progressive ideas about, being a woman. So it's, it does vary a lot. I do know that for, there's such a hierarchical, and this is just not just for women, but it's just in the family and in society, there's a very hierarchical structure of relationships that exist. And so I think that for many women and men and children, that hierarchy is always respected, and that's always very important to remember, no matter what Afghan women you're dealing with. Another thing that I think is also important to mention is that in Afghan society, Afghan women are considered kind of like the standards by which morality is judged, and they carry that responsibility of passing the values of the society to younger generations. So in terms of kind of understanding some of those dynamics a little bit better, that would be something that's important. So in that context, a lot of times in Afghan society, Afghan men are seen as responsible for ensuring women's virtue and their honor, because a woman's reputation is a direct reflection of her family. So I think that it's very important to, on a case-by-case basis, to understand each Afghan woman, understand their needs, understand their belief system when it comes to their own self-identity, as a woman within the larger context of culture.
Yeah, I think that was great. And I think the only thing that I would add to that is, as people living in the US and as someone who was, raised in the US, I think the automatic tendency is always to just associate, gender norms and gender equality to what like the American or Western standard is. And I think for people that are working with these newcomers, it's incredibly important to understand that these people and these women, were born and raised in Afghanistan and are surrounded by the norms of that society. And that's not to say that means that we, should excuse any instance of gender inequality or domestic violence against women. But it's just to understand that there are, I guess, like differences in the ways that, people in America or people in the West see what is considered to be gender equality versus, people in Afghanistan. I think it's just something that needs to take time. As these newcomers, get situated with being in the United States, but also just to understand that within Afghan culture and within Islam, especially because the majority of them are Muslim, to understand what the role of the woman is. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's taking away from their sort of empowerment if the role of the woman is different in that society versus what we're, I guess, familiar with. So just to be conscious of that would be the most important thing.
Megan, can I make a quick comment overall regarding the process of integration quickly? Is that possible?
Sure, and I'll just make a note. I see we are at the 90-minute mark for anyone who does have to head off to their next meeting. Thank you. We'd love for you to complete our feedback survey on your way out. But if our panelists and speakers are willing, we can stay on for maybe another 5 minutes to wrap up.
Great. I do want to say, I want to make sure that we as Americans, we tend to kind of have this model minority issue at times where we believe that minorities need to be extremely amazing, and the only way we accept them is if they're model citizens in every single way. And we have a challenge. This is not only as it pertains to this newly arrived Afghan population. This is the case with the Latino community, with African American communities, with the Asian community. I mean, this notion of model minority is something that we all struggle with and we have to deal with. I want us to know that we as a nation, really of immigrants, we as a nation of layered refugees, hundreds of years of immigrants and refugees. Some of us came here by choice. Some communities were brought here by force. And those layers, it took a very long time for those communities to develop identity, to develop integration models and assimilation models. And I think we need to be extremely careful for us not to think that just because we allowed just 70,000 Afghans to come to this country, like, you all need to learn the laws and respect the rules, and if you don't like it, get out of here. That is not something that we want to make sure we don't want to reinforce that. We want to make sure that we allow for integration, authentic, proper integration of communities, so that then they can build their own communities, have successful citizens and contributing members of society. For us, I think that's an extremely important thing to think about, because especially in some of the political environments that we function in now, it's all about, oh, model minority. If an Afghan does something wrong, that is a reflection of all Afghans. That is not the case. If a Muslim does something wrong, that is a reflection of all Muslims. That is not the case. You have people who are doing amazing things. Most of the people on here who were presenters came here as refugees, probably when they were much younger, like myself. But we went through the whole process with the difficulty and the challenges, and we were able to establish communities that were healthy. And I think we need to make sure that we allow for those communities to develop and to function, and that we don't have this model minority expectation from the day one that they get here. It is a process.
Great. Thank you all for such thoughtful responses to the many questions that we received today. And I think that's a really excellent concluding note, Haris. So of course, we weren't able to answer everything. Switchboard will do our best to respond to any specific questions that we received that we weren't able to answer today. But otherwise, I would really encourage everyone here to stay tuned to our newsletter for forthcoming training and resources as service providers continue to engage with Afghan newcomers in the coming weeks and months. On that note, we do have a number of recommended resources that you'll receive via email, along with the recording, slides, and transcript for today's webinar. So some of the ones you see on the slide here will be sent over to you. Just briefly to review our learning objectives, as Farid introduced at the beginning, we hope that following today's training, you received an introduction to who Afghan newcomers are, the events that led to their displacement, that you learned a few cultural guidelines and do's and don'ts. You can name a few expectations and potential misconceptions that you might encounter in supporting Afghan newcomers, and that you'll be able to communicate with Afghan newcomers a bit more effectively using these provided tips and guidelines. Although we all recognize that, as Har said, this is a process both for newly arriving Afghans as well as for service providers and communities. So today is just a short introduction to this topic. Recognizing the additional 5 minutes of your time that you've given us, we will wrap it up there. You have our contact information on the screen for those interested in staying in touch with Switchboard. Don't hesitate to reach out with other questions for us. And a final plug for our feedback survey. You will see this open in your browser, depending on the way you joined this webinar today, or you'll get the link via email. That's a very short survey that helps us a lot in improving our training going forward. Thank you all again for making some time for this important topic today. We really appreciate your participation, and a huge, huge thank you to our facilitators, Farid and Durana, as well as our amazing panelists, Haris, Rosalind, and Wais. Thank you everybody so much.